Thank you for tuning in to the newest episode of the Plain Bible Teaching Podcast. I'm your host, Andy Soker. This episode is being released on September 14th, 2023. And this week, we're talking about hustle culture. Well, what is that? It has to do with the idea of engaging in some type of work in addition to one's regular job. Sometimes it's referred to as a side hustle, in order to pursue some personally fulfilling goal, whether that's in the work itself or the advantages that come from the additional income from that work. Well, is this something that is in harmony with the teachings and principles of Scripture, or is it something that Christians should be wary about? We're going to talk about that in our episode today. For links to the article we're considering and other related materials, check out the show notes for this episode at plainbibleteaching.com/podcast/091423. Now for our discussion this week. Does Christianity encourage hustle culture? From Bible Study Tools. Whether you have heard the term hustle culture or not, you have probably been impacted by it. Terms like on the grind or working a side hustle are more and more prevalent in our society. With the rise of the gig economy, it seems like people are either looking for a hustle or engaged in one. Granted, some people are doing this to make ends meet, and you must respect that. But are we in danger of taking this too far? While the hustle culture is prevalent in society, has it found its way into the church? And if it has, is it supposed to be that way? What is hustle culture? Hustle culture is the mindset that you must always be working hard in pursuit of your dreams, goals, and aspirations. The engagement in the hustle takes center place in your life as you go after your pursuits at all costs. This can lead to neglecting other aspects of your life because you are going after the dream. So in talking about hustle culture, whether it's good or not, it really comes down to how we define what we're talking about. And I believe the author of that article gave a good definition of what we're talking about here. But what he called the greatest example in the Bible, which is not in the excerpt that we read, but you can read the article and see it for yourself. But he said what was probably the greatest example of this in the Bible was Martha, who was too distracted by preparations to sit down and listen to Jesus. Personally, I would not put Martha in the same category as one who works a full-time job, drives for Uber, and runs an online business. But that being said, the author did make some good points in that article that are worth considering. You can read what he wrote when you have a chance. The article will be linked in the show notes. But there are a few other points when we think about this idea that I want us to consider. Number one, Christians are to be hard working. Ecclesiastes 9 and verse 10 says, "Whatever your hand finds to do, do it with all your might. For there is no activity or planning or knowledge or wisdom in Sheol where you're going." God's people, when they exercise wisdom, which is part of what Ecclesiastes is about, are to work hard. And not only are we to be diligent in our work, but if possible, we need to work above and beyond whatever we need just to get by because of the uncertainties of life. The wise man went on to talk about this in Ecclesiastes 11 and verse 6, where he said, "Sow your seed in the morning and do not be idle in the evening. For you do not know whether morning or evening sowing will succeed or whether both of them alike will be good." So because we don't know what the future holds and we don't know what we might need in the days ahead or in the months ahead, and we don't know whether the work is going to be successful or not, he said, don't think that, well, I can just work in the morning and that's going to be enough. I don't have to work any more than that. No, work in the morning, work in the evening because you don't know what's going to happen. Now, of course, that was in the Old Testament. But Paul clearly indicated in the New Testament that this idea of working hard was for Christians as well. He told the brethren in Colossae in Colossians 3:23, "Whatever you do, do your work heartily as for the Lord rather than for men." And not only that, but working more than just what we need to cover our bare necessities is also for Christians too. He wrote in Ephesians 4 verse 28, "He who steals must steal no longer, but rather he must labor, performing with his own hands what is good, so that he will have something to share with one who has need." Notice he says in that verse that when you work as a Christian, don't think, well, what is the least that I need to get by, and that's how much I'm going to work, and then I'm not going to work any beyond that. No, he says you work hard, you work to provide for yourselves, but also you work so that you might be in a position to be able to help others as well. That means you work beyond just your basic necessities so that you can have something to share with the one who has need. So we see from the scriptures, God's people are to be hard-working people. The second point that I want us to notice is that the 40-hour work week is a man-made concept. There are many people, including people in the church, but there are many people who are critical of anyone who works more than 40 hours a week. 40 hours, at least in our country here, is considered to be full-time. And anyone who works beyond that runs the risk of someone accusing them of being a workaholic, or that they are simply just focused on work and not able to focus on anything else. Well, the 40-hour work week is not a biblical concept. Its origins can be traced back to the Industrial Revolution. And there was a push for it in the United States in various industries in the 1800s, but it was not standard in the U.S. as far as federal law until the 1930s. But remember Jesus' parable about the laborers in the vineyard and the typical workday that he described for that time period. Matthew 20, beginning in verse 1, he says, "For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard. When he agreed with the laborers for a denarius for the day, he sent them into his vineyard. And he went out about the third hour and saw others standing idle in the marketplace. And to those he said, 'You also go into the vineyard, and whatever is right I will give you.' And so they went. Again he went out about the 6th and the 9th hour and did the same thing. And about the 11th hour he went out and found others standing around, and he said to them, 'Why have you been standing here idle all day long?' They said to him, 'Because no one hired us.' He said to them, 'You go into the vineyard too.'" Now, of course, Jesus was making a point about the kingdom and those who would enter into the kingdom at various times throughout their lives and during the opportunity that they had to work in the kingdom. And his point was that they're all going to receive the same reward. But when we think about what he described there, that was a 12-hour workday. And remember, they worked 6 days a week. They rested on the 7th day. So if they work 6 days a week and they're working 12-hour days, that is a 72-hour work week. Now, does that mean that we should be working a 72-hour work week today? No, at least not necessarily. But it does mean that we should not automatically be critical of someone who has a full-time job and then works 10 to 20 hours on the side. When we do that, we are making a man-made rule based on culture, not based on the Bible. We're making a man-made rule and being critical of people that we maybe shouldn't be critical of. The third point is that there are times when we need to work above and beyond what is typical. When Paul went to Corinth, Luke recorded that he stayed with Aquila and Priscilla, and they were working, for by trade they were tent makers, and he was reasoning in the synagogue every Sabbath and trying to persuade Jews and Greeks. But when Silas and Timothy came down from Macedonia, Paul began devoting himself completely to the word. So part of the time that Paul was there in Corinth, he had to work to support himself. He worked making tents while also preaching the gospel. But eventually, he was able to focus just on preaching, devote himself completely to the word. And that was not the only time that Paul did this. In fact, he described what he did in his second letter to the church at Thessalonica, in 2 Thessalonians 3, beginning in verse 7. For you yourselves know how you ought to follow our example, because we did not act in an undisciplined manner among you, nor did we eat anyone's bread without paying for it. But with labor and hardship we kept working night and day, so that we would not be a burden to any of you. Not because we did not have the right to this, but in order to offer ourselves as a model for you so that you would follow our example. There was a time when Paul worked night and day. Why did he do that? He said there in that passage, it was to show them an example. Because sometimes Christians need to work like this. Go above and beyond what they would normally work, even if it maybe isn't something that they necessarily want to do. And the fourth point, we do need to recognize our limitations. Remember the example that we read about of Paul in Corinth, that while he was working as a tent maker, he was still able to preach, but he was not able to devote himself completely to the word. Paul couldn't do everything, and we can't do everything either. The more we work, the less time we have for rest, for family, for friendships, for our brethren, and so on. There are only so many hours in the day. That's not to say it's wrong to have a side hustle or something like that. It's not necessarily wrong to work more hours than what our society deems as full-time employment. But we do need to exercise wisdom. Remember what Paul said in Ephesians chapter 5, verses 15 and 16. Therefore be careful how you walk, not as unwise men, but as wise, making the most of your time, because the days are evil. And then the fifth point, we cannot allow other pursuits to get in the way of spiritual things. In the parable of the sower, Jesus described the thorny ground and why the seed did not take root there. He said, the seed which fell among the thorns, these are the ones who have heard. And as they go on their way, they are choked with worries and riches and pleasures of this life, and they bring no fruit to maturity. In another parable, in the parable of the wedding feast, he described why people paid no attention to the invitation that was offered to them. Again, he sent out other slaves saying, tell those who have been invited, behold, I have prepared my dinner. My oxen, my fattened livestock are all butchered, and everything is ready. Come to the wedding feast. But they paid no attention, and went their way, one to his own farm, another to his business. In both of those parables, people allowed the things of this life to get in the way of their place in the Lord's kingdom. Now, what he mentioned there in those parables, working on one's farm, that's something that's good. Running a business, that's also good. Earning an income that will enable you to provide for your own and help others, that's good. Even enjoying the blessings of life, that is also good. But we cannot allow anything to distract us from what is truly important. Matthew 6 verse 33 says, seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. If our side hustle, or whatever we're trying to gain from the extra income from our additional work, if that has become more important to us than our spiritual responsibilities, then that has become an idol. And that means it's a problem in our heart and we need to fix it. So as we wrap all of this up, we ask this question, is hustle culture compatible with Christianity? And again, it depends on how we're going to define those terms. We know from the scriptures that God's people are to be hard working, and we should not think that working 40 hours a week is a limitation that God has placed upon us. And those who want to say that it is, they're making rules that God has not made. There may be times when we, like Paul, have to work night and day. We have to work an extra job. We have to work more hours than maybe we normally do. At the same time, we do need to exercise wisdom. Exercise wisdom based upon an understanding of our own limitations. And then in everything, whether we're working a side hustle or not, we need to make sure that we keep the Lord first in our lives. that's all for this week. Thank you for listening to the Plain Bible Teaching Podcast. I hope you found this to be interesting, informative, and helpful. For links to the story we talked about and other related materials, visit the show notes for this episode at plainbibleteaching.com/podcast/091423. If you have a moment to rate and review the podcast or share it with others that would be interested, I would certainly appreciate that. And if you're listening to this, remember that we also upload video versions of the podcast to the Plain Bible Teaching YouTube channel. So if you prefer to watch this on video, then that option is there for you. And if you are watching this on YouTube, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and you can see other videos that we post here from time to time. And if you see a news story or have some topic that you think would make for a good discussion, send that to me at andy@plainbibleteaching.com. Thanks again for listening, and I hope to talk to you again next week.